Paul sat in the dimly lit theater, his hands resting on the armrests of the worn velvet seat. The air smelled of dust, old wood, and faint traces of perfume from the audience around him. He wasn't a man who often attended such performances. Ballet had never been something he followed, nor did he have much interest in dance at all. But tonight was different. Tonight, something held him there, keeping him in his seat long after the opening act had begun. It had been his friend, Mark, who had invited him. "Come on, Paul," Mark had said. "You need to get out. You can't just work and go home every day. Live a little." Paul had almost refused. At 48, he had settled into a life of quiet routines. His marriage had ended nearly 5 years ago, and since then, he had convinced himself that he was better off alone. Love, passion, excitement, those things were for younger men. He had tried them all once, and they had led him nowhere. But still, he had agreed to come, telling himself it was just a harmless evening out. Now, as he sat in the back row, he watched. The dancers glide across the stage, their bodies moving in perfect harmony. It was impressive, he admitted, but it didn't stir anything in him. At least, not until she appeared. She stepped onto the stage with effortless grace, her red dress flowing around her like liquid fire. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, accentuating the sharp lines of her face. But it was her movement, fluid, delicate, yet filled with an almost untamed energy, that made Paul sit up a little straighter. She was different from the others. Every spin, every leap, every stretch of her arm felt like it carried a deeper meaning, as if she wasn't just dancing to entertain, but to express something only she understood. The way she moved was hypnotic, and Paul found himself leaning forward without realizing it. His heart beat faster, a reaction he hadn't expected. Who was she? As the performance continued, he couldn't take his eyes off her. The other dancers faded into the background, mere shadows compared to the light she radiated. She was young, far, younger than him. But that didn't stop the rush of emotions stirring inside him. For years, Paul had believed that he was done feeling this way. He had loved once, maybe even twice, but time had made him cautious, guarded. He told himself that desire, attraction, all of it faded with age. He had convinced himself that it was better to live without the complications of love. Yet, here he was, captivated by a woman he didn't even know. When the final note of music played and the stage lights dimmed, Paul exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. The applause was thunderous, the audience rising to their feet in appreciation. He clapped too, though his mind was elsewhere. As the dancers bowed and left the stage, he felt a strange pull, a sudden urge to see her again, not just as a performer, but as a person. Before he could stop himself, he stood up and made his way toward the exit, his eyes scanning the crowd. He didn't even know what he was looking for. Maybe just a glimpse of her offstage, something to prove that she was real and not some dream conjured by the dim theater lights. Then, he saw her. She stepped out of a side door near the backstage area, laughing as she spoke to another dancer. Up close, she was even more striking, her youthful energy so effortless, so natural. Paul hesitated, unsure of what he was doing. What would he even say? He was just a man in the audience, a stranger. And yet, as he stood there, something inside him refused to let him walk away. Would she notice him? Would fate bring them together? Paul didn't know the answer, but for the first time in years, he wanted to find out. Paul stood near the theater exit, pretending to check his phone. The crowd around him was buzzing with excitement, people discussing the performance in animated voices. Couples walked hand in hand, groups of friends laughed together, and theater. Staff moved in and out of the building, tidying up after the evening's show. But Paul wasn't interested in any of that. His eyes searched for her. He told himself he was being ridiculous. She was a dancer, a performer. She probably had dozens of admirers waiting for her after every show. Why would she notice him? a man nearly twice her age, a stranger who had just happened to be in the audience. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Then, as if fate had been listening, she appeared. She stepped out of the backstage door, surrounded by a group of dancers. She was laughing, her dark eyes bright with excitement. She no longer wore the red dress from her performance, but simple jeans and a fitted sweater. Without the stage lights, without the glamour of the theater, she looked different, more real, more approachable. Paul hesitated. What was he doing? Was he really going to walk up to her and introduce himself? What if she found it strange? Before he could decide, something unexpected happened. A strong gust of wind blew past them, and suddenly, a light scarf that had been draped over her shoulders lifted into the air. It danced wildly for a moment before landing near Paul's feet. Instinctively, he bent down and picked it up. "Excuse me?" he said, stepping forward. "This is yours." She turned toward him, her face still flushed from laughter. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Paul felt time slow down. She looked at him, surprised at first, but then her lips curved into a smile. "Oh," she said, taking the scarf from his hands. "Thank you. That was kind of you." Paul felt his heart race. Her voice was soft, yet filled with confidence. "It's nothing," he replied, trying to keep his tone casual. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. "Were you at the show?" He nodded. "Yes, I don't usually come to these things, but I'm glad I did." Her smile widened. "Did you enjoy it?" Paul exhaled, trying to find the right words. "It was breathtaking," she chuckled. "That's a good answer." For a moment, they just stood there, the noise of the street fading into the background. Paul couldn't believe this was happening. He had imagined watching her from afar, maybe leaving the theater with nothing but a memory. But now, he was here, talking to her. Before he could say anything else, one of the dancers called her name. "Lily, we're heading out. You coming?" Lily glanced back at her friends, then turned to Paul again. "I have to go," she said, but then to his surprise, she added, "See you around, Paul." And just like that, she winked at him and walked away, disappearing into the crowd with the other dancers. Paul stood there, his mind spinning. She had remembered his name. She had smiled at him. Was it just politeness? A simple exchange between a performer and an audience member, or had there been something more in her eyes? Paul wasn't sure, but as he walked away from the theater that night, he felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years, a spark, a possibility, and, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to chase it. Paul couldn't stop thinking about her. Ever since that brief conversation outside the theater, her voice had echoed in his mind. The way she had smiled at him, the way she had said his name. Lily. It was such a simple name, yet it carried something, light and fresh, like spring air. It had been years since Paul had felt this way. Attraction, desire, excitement. These emotions had faded with time, buried beneath responsibilities, disappointments, and the quiet acceptance that passion belonged to younger men. But now, at 48, here he was, restless, unable to shake the image of a woman who was far too young for him. He told himself it was nothing, a passing interest, a silly admiration for someone who possessed a kind of youthful energy he no longer had. But if that were true, why was he back at the theater a week later? This time he had no excuse. The first time Mark had invited him. This time he had come alone. He sat in the same darkened theater, watching the dancers with quiet anticipation. The performance was different tonight. A new routine, new music. But his focus remained the same. Then she appeared. Lily stepped onto the stage, and just like before, she commanded his attention. Her movements were like poetry, every step precise, yet full of raw energy. She wasn't just performing. She was feeling every note of the music, letting it move through her body like a living force. Paul found himself mesmerized, leaning forward in his seat, lost in the way she moved. When the performance ended and the applause filled the theater, Paul sat frozen for a moment before clapping. This time, he knew he couldn't just leave. He stepped outside and waited near the same backstage exit, unsure of what he was even hoping for. What would he say if he saw her? Would she remember him? Or would she see him as just another face in the crowd? Then, as if the universe had heard his silent questions, the door opened, and she walked out. Lily noticed him almost immediately. A small smirk appeared on her lips as she walked toward him. "Paul," she said, tilting her head. "Are you following me?" He chuckled, feeling nervous under her gaze. "Maybe I just enjoy good dancing," she raised an eyebrow. "Or maybe you just enjoy watching me." Paul had no answer to that. She was direct, confident in a way that both excited and unnerved him. He wasn't used to this. Women his age were careful, with their words, guarded, weighed down by experience. Lily, on the other hand, was fearless. Before he could come up with a response, she surprised him. "There's a small gathering tonight," she said. "Some of the dancers are going. You should come." Paul blinked. "Me?" "Yes, you." She crossed her arms, her eyes filled with mischief. "Unless you're afraid?" "Afraid? No. Hesitant. Absolutely. He was nearly twice her age. What business did he have? At a party filled with young, vibrant dancers? Wouldn't he stand out? Wouldn't they wonder why he was there? But then he saw the way Lily was looking at him, like she was inviting him into something new, something exciting. And just like that, all his doubts vanished. "All right," he said. Lily grinned. "Good. Don't be late." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving Paul standing there, his heart pounding. Was this reckless? Probably. Was he making a mistake? Maybe. But for the first time in years, Paul didn't care. He had spent too long being careful, too long doing what was expected. Tonight, for once, he would do what he wanted, even if it led him somewhere dangerous. Paul hesitated outside the address Lily had given him. It was an upscale apartment complex, the kind of place that belonged to young professionals, artists, and dreamers who were still finding their way in the world. He didn't belong here. He knew that. But still, here he was, standing at the entrance, questioning every decision that had brought him to this moment. What was he doing? A man his age should have been at home, watching the late-night news, maybe reading a book. Instead, he was about to walk into a party filled with young dancers, stepping into a world he didn't fully understand. But when he thought of Lily, her eyes, her voice, the way she had looked at him, he felt something stir inside him. Excitement, curiosity, a desire to be near her, even if just for one night. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The moment he entered, he was hit by the pulse of music vibrating through the walls. The apartment was filled with people. Young, energetic, alive. Some were lounging on couches, others were dancing, their bodies moving fluidly as if the music controlled them. The scent of wine, perfume, and something faintly sweet lingered in the air. Paul felt out of place. Then he saw her. Lily stood near the window laughing with a group of friends, a glass of wine in her hand. She was effortlessly beautiful, dressed in a simple black dress that hugged her form just enough to be dangerous. She spotted him almost instantly. Her smile widened, and without hesitation, she made her way toward him. "You came," she said, her voice smooth and playful. Paul shrugged, trying to appear more confident than he felt. "I said I would." Lily tilted her head, studying him with amusement. "And here I thought you might change your mind." Almost did, he admitted. But something told me I shouldn't. She leaned in slightly, her eyes locking onto his. Good. I would have been disappointed if you hadn't. The way she said it made his pulse quicken. Come on, she said, grabbing his hand. Let me introduce you to some people. She led him through the crowd, introducing him to dancers, musicians, and artists. They were friendly, welcoming, but Paul could sense their curiosity. He was different from them, older, wiser perhaps, but different. At first he felt awkward, answering questions about his work, his life, his reason for being there. But the more he talked, the more he relaxed. Maybe he didn't belong here in the way the others did, but that didn't mean he couldn't enjoy the moment. Lily never left his side. She laughed at his dry humor, poured him another drink, and pulled him onto the small balcony when the noise inside became too much. The cool night air hit them, and for a moment, everything felt quiet. I like you, Paul, she said suddenly, turning to face him. He exhaled, caught off guard. That so? She nodded. You're different. Most men I meet are predictable. You're not. Paul let out a low chuckle. I think most people would call me boring. I don't, she said, her gaze holding his. Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Paul knew what was happening. He could feel it in the way she looked at him, the way she stood close, her body just inches from his. He should have stepped back. He should have reminded himself of the years between them, the risks, the complications, but he didn't. Instead, he reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Lily didn't move away. She didn't stop him. Instead, she smiled. And in that moment, Paul knew. He had already fallen too deep. The city lights stretched below them, a sea of golden specks flickering in the night. Paul leaned against the balcony railing, his fingers wrapped around his glass, but he barely tasted the wine. His senses were too preoccupied with Lily, her scent, her presence, the way she stood so close beside him. He had spent his life making careful choices, calculated, reasonable, safe. But nothing about tonight felt safe. It felt reckless, dangerous, intoxicating. Lily turned to him, her dark eyes catching the glow from the apartment behind them. You're quiet, she said, tilting her head. Thinking again? Paul let out a slow breath. Thinking might not be a good idea right now. She smiled. Then don't. As if testing him, she reached for his hand, her fingers brushing lightly against his. It was a simple touch, barely anything at all, but it sent a current through him, shaking something loose inside him. He looked down at their hands, his throat tightening. Lily. She stepped closer, so close that he could feel the warmth of her body. Paul, tell me, what are you so afraid of? His heart pounded. It wasn't just her age. It wasn't just the fact that she was young and full of life, while he had already lived through decades of experiences. It was the fact that she wanted him, and he wanted her back. Lily, this isn't simple, he said, his voice lower. Than before, she smirked. Nothing worth feeling ever is. She was fearless, and in that moment, Paul wished he could be too. Her hand slid up his arm, tracing lightly over the fabric of his shirt. His skin burned beneath her touch. He should have pulled away. He should have told her that this was a mistake. But he didn't. Instead, he reached for her, his fingers gently brushing against her cheek before sliding to the back of her neck. She leaned into his touch, her breath soft against his skin. And then, finally, he gave in. He kissed her. The moment their lips met, everything else faded. The city lights, the music inside, the quiet voice in his head warning him to stop. None of it mattered. All that mattered was the way she melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck as she deepened the kiss. She tasted of wine and something sweet, something dangerous. His hands traced down her back, feeling the curve of her waist, the warmth of her body pressing against his. He had forgotten what this felt like. This rush, this hunger, this loss of control. Lily pulled away just slightly, her lips barely an inch from his. "See?" she whispered. "Not so scary, is it?" Paul exhaled sharply, his hands still resting on her waist. "I should be smarter than this." She smiled, running her fingers through his hair. "Or maybe, for once, you should stop thinking so much." For a moment, he almost laughed. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had spent too many years trapped in logic, in fear, in the idea that passion was something left behind in youth. But here, in this moment, with her, he didn't feel old. He felt alive. Lily took his hand and pulled him gently toward the "Come inside," she murmured. Paul hesitated, his heart warring with his mind. But as he looked into her eyes, he knew he had already crossed the line. There was no turning back now. Paul followed Lily inside, his heartbeat quickening with every step. The apartment was still alive with music and laughter, but none of it mattered anymore. The world outside had blurred into insignificance. All he could focus on was the warmth of her hand in his, the way she led him through the crowd without hesitation, as if she had already decided that tonight he belonged to her. They moved past groups of dancers, past bottles of wine and half-empty glasses, past knowing glances from her friends who seemed to sense the electricity between them. But Paul didn't care what they thought. He didn't care about anything except the quiet promise in Lily's eyes. She led him down a narrow hallway, away from the noise, until they reached a dimly lit room. She pushed open the door and Paul stepped inside, his pulse pounding in his ears. The door closed behind them with a quiet click, and suddenly they were alone. Paul turned to face her, his body tense with a mixture of excitement and hesitation. "Lily, are you sure about this?" She smiled, slow, confident, knowing. "Are you?" He should have said no. He should have reminded himself that this was temporary, that he was almost 50, that she was young and free and had her whole life ahead of her. But then she stepped closer, sliding her hands up his chest, her fingers tracing the edge of his collar. "You think too much, Paul," she whispered, tilting her head. "Just feel." And with that, she kissed him. This time, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. Paul wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against him as their lips met in a heated frenzy. It was wild and reckless, unlike anything he had felt in years. His hands roamed down her back, gripping her waist, savoring the way she melted into him. Lily pushed him back until his legs hit the edge of the bed. He sat down, breathless, as she climbed onto his lap, straddling him with ease. Her fingers tangled in his hair, tugging lightly, teasing him. "You like control, don't you?" she murmured against his lips. Paul exhaled sharply. "Not tonight." She grinned. "Good." She kissed him again, deeper this time, her body pressing into his, her warmth sinking into his skin. Paul lost himself in her. He forgot about the years between them. He forgot about the consequences. He forgot about everything, except the way she made him feel. But somewhere, in the back of his mind, a warning still lingered. This wasn't just passion. This was dangerous. And soon, there would be no turning back. The morning light crept through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the room. Paul lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind tangled in a storm of thoughts. Lily slept beside him, her bare shoulder peeking from beneath the sheets, her breath slow and steady. She looked peaceful, unaware of the war raging inside him. Last night had been unlike anything he had experienced in years. It had been wild, passionate, free. But now, in the cold light of morning, reality returned like a wave crashing against him. What had he done? He was 48. She was in her 20s. They lived in different worlds, played by different rules. What had felt thrilling last night now felt reckless, impossible. He turned onto his side, watching her, trying to convince himself that this could be simple, that it could be just one night. But deep down, he knew better. Lily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw him watching her, she smiled, a slow, sleepy smile that made his heart clench. "Morning?" she murmured, stretching lazily. Paul forced a small smile. "Morning." She reached out, tracing her fingers along his jaw. "You're thinking again," she teased. He sighed. "It's hard not to." Lily sat up slightly, resting on one elbow. "Regrets already?" He hesitated. "Not regrets, just—" He ran a hand through his hair. "Reality." She studied him for a moment, her playful expression fading slightly. "You think this was a mistake?" Paul didn't know how to answer that. If he said yes, he would be lying. But if he said no, he would be ignoring the complications. "I think—" He exhaled. "I don't know what happens next." Lily sat up fully, pulling the sheet around her. "Why does something have to happen next?" "Because this—" He gestured between them. "This wasn't just nothing." Her gaze softened. "No, it wasn't." Silence stretched between them. Then she reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Paul, I like you," she said quietly. "I don't care about the age difference. I don't care what people will think. The only question is, do you?" Did he? He had spent years convincing himself that passion belonged to the young, that love, real love, was for people who hadn't been worn down by life. But Lily had shattered those beliefs. She made him feel alive again. And yet, "This won't be easy," he said, searching her eyes. "People will talk. They'll judge. You could have anyone, Lily. Someone your age. Someone with a future that matches yours." She squeezed his hand. "And what if you're the future I want?" Paul's breath caught. He hadn't expected that, hadn't expected her. He had come into this thinking he was chasing a fleeting moment, a reckless thrill. But now, he realized, Lily wasn't just a distraction, she was a possibility. A chance to break free from the careful, predictable life he had built. A chance to feel, to risk, to love again. Slowly, he reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Are you sure about this?" She smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything." Paul exhaled, the weight on his chest lifting just slightly. Maybe. This was crazy. Maybe it was dangerous. But for the first time in years, he was ready to take the risk. He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her lips. Whatever happened next, they would face it together.